So, Mr. Lamb, you're Liberal Democrat MP for Norfolk North. You're also the Shadow Health Secretary. I was looking at your website, and earlier on this week, you were quoted as saying that the rise in binge drinking amongst younger people in Britain is dangerously escalating into a public health crisis with tragic consequences. Do you not believe that the same can be said in relation to young people and illicit drugs?
Well, talking to health professionals, I find a greater level of concern about alcohol consumption than I do about illicit drugs. Obviously, with cannabis, there are particular concerns about the link to schizophrenia, for example. But I think the biggest anxiety at the moment is the growth of alcohol consumption amongst teenagers, particularly the spirits, very strong alcohols, and vodka often being the drink of choice. But the volumes involved are staggering. And I mean, from a sort of liberal perspective, one doesn't want to go down any route of sort of prohibition, but inevitably, as a health spokesman, I've got a concern about the consequences for people's own health. Where it does, however, affect sort of public policy particularly, is where it has an effect on other people, and the link between alcohol and violence, I think, is something that we've got to take serious note of, whether it's domestic violence and all of the evidence there, but also the violence on streets on Friday and Saturday night.
Yeah, sure, but in relation to cannabis more specifically, there's been a lot of media coverage concerning some of the negative effects associated with consuming cannabis, namely psychosis. And I was wondering whether there's actually been an increase in the number of young people being admitted to hospital with related psychiatric conditions as a direct consequence of smoking the drug.
Well, I can't point to a specific trend that one can identify as being linked to cannabis, but I am acutely aware of the research evidence that indicates the link. And I think because of the strength of cannabis smoked often these days, I think we have to be acutely concerned and aware of the potential risks there. And I think it's one of the most important things is about raising awareness, making youngsters understand the potential dangers involved. I mean, I'm a father of two well, one's just turned 20, but a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old. And I'm very careful to focus their concerns and their awareness on the potential risks involved.
Okay, but in relation to cannabis, once again, one of our questions this month is, would the legalization of all drugs be maybe a step forward, as legalization is usually characterized by sort of regulation and taxation, and the government could maybe regulate what's actually being smoked and also tax people on what's being smoked, and the money gained from that taxation could then be pumped back into the health service treating problem drug users and other addicts?
I think it should be properly assessed and analysed, and I think we've got to learn lessons from other countries. I haven't got to the point yet of concluding myself that there should be a legalisation, but I think it's very important for policymakers to look at evidence from elsewhere and to consider what the impact of that may be in terms of future policy making. My understanding is that the reclassification has not led to an increase in consumption, has in fact led to or there has been a decrease in consumption at the same time as it's become, in a sense, a lower criminal priority, which is interesting because those who are who were very strongly opposed to reducing the classification argued at the time that this would cause untold horrors and that it would result in an increase in use. That hasn't happened, the reverse has happened. And so I think that's quite an important lesson for us to learn. And you know, I've got an open mind ultimately about future policy, and I want policy to be based on evidence as much as possible about what works and what leads to good health consequences for people concerned.
But depending on what statistics you actually look at, young people and teenagers in the UK take more drugs more often than most other countries in the rest of Europe. Do you think that the government maybe should implement a new innovative strategy, because clearly the current one isn't actually working?
I think that's right. I mean, the interesting thing is that if you, in the UK, we've tended to adopt the strategy on most drugs of a strong central disapproval and tough criminal sanctions attached to it. You rightly point out that the effect of that policy has been higher usage in this country than the rest of Europe. That suggests that the current policy at least has to be questioned, and we need, I think, at a policy level to be open-minded about looking at what has worked effectively in other countries. As I say, as a liberal, my concern primarily is about the impact that either drug or alcohol taking has on other people. John Stuart Mill talks all about the effect of your actions on other people. In terms of your actions, the actions that you take on the effect on yourself, then I think it's important for us to be to concentrate as much as we can on providing information so that people make informed decisions. But I think for the future we have to look at other approaches, because the approach that we've taken in this country so far appears to have failed.
And finally, as you may already be aware, the government has actually released its new comprehensive drug strategy today, which tries to combat, well, will aim to combat some of the £15 billion costs economically and socially that drug use has on our society. Do you think this sort of new zero tolerance policy within the strategy, such as taking away welfare benefits of those drug users who do not turn up for treatment, let's say, do you think that is a step in the right direction, or do you think that's the wrong approach for maybe the government to be taking?
My initial reaction is to be very cautious about what the government is proposing and to be suspicious of it. It's one of those things that smacks of being a policy designed for a headline of looking tough. Whether it would be effective and helpful to those individuals, because at the end of the day we ought to be focusing as much as possible on the strategy that helps those people get off drugs. Now, sometimes you need a carrot and stick approach. Sometimes there needs to be, clear boundaries for people to work within. So I don't rule out some sort of strictures to people who are in that situation, but you could very easily have the law of unintended consequences applying and stigmatising people even more and marginalising them even more, and that would be disastrous.
Mr. Lamb, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure.